While we most often hear of crimes being solved with the same few types of physical evidence, such as fingerprints, DNA, and ballistics, not all cases provide investigators with such a wealth of useful clues. In some situations, police are forced to get creative, and when these techniques are successful, they end up making for some pretty fascinating stories. Today, we wanted to look at 3 such cases, stories where weird or unprecedented pieces of evidence proved to be the key to solving a crime. Just before we get to today's stories, a reminder that if you find our videos interesting and informative, to like and subscribe to Crime Zone for more true crime content like this. It really helps us to continue building the channel, and if you've watched a few of our videos already, you might not even realize that you're not subscribed. While you're there, don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest releases. With that out of the way, here are 3 crimes solved with weird bits of evidence. In June of 2008, a man from the town of Lapua, Finland, found himself the unlucky victim of a car theft. He reported the crime to police, but if you're familiar with these types of cases, then you likely know that crimes of this nature tend to have a pretty low clearance rate. Several weeks passed, and police were actually fortunate enough to stumble across the stolen vehicle. It had been abandoned near a train station in Seinäjoki, a city located about a 30-minute drive south of Lapua that, according to sources we came across, is one of Finland's fastest-growing urban centers. With the vehicle found, the next task quickly became figuring out who had stolen it in the first place. While searching for fingerprints and other traditional pieces of forensic evidence that a culprit might generally leave behind at a crime scene, local police discovered something interesting. Inside the abandoned vehicle was a mosquito, one that looked like it had eaten pretty recently. Deciding to follow up on the lead, investigators sent off the insect for testing, and discovered that it indeed had a small amount of blood inside it that it had sucked out that belonged to a person. Amazingly, when the blood sample was tested, it came back as a match to a man that was in the country's criminal DNA database. When police confronted the suspect, he denied stealing the car, saying that the owner had given him a ride while he had been hitchhiking. However, the vehicle owner denied this, believing, along with police, that this had been the man who had stolen his car. Unfortunately, this is where information about the case seems to more or less drop off, as despite the DNA match, police weren't sure if prosecutors viewed the evidence as strong enough to take to court. Still, investigators themselves seemed pretty confident that they had found their man, with the inspector in charge of the case at the time saying that it was the first case in the country that had been solved using mosquitoes. That same inspector praised the thoroughness and ingenuity of his investigative team at the time, stating, quote, "It's not easy to find a small mosquito in a car. This just shows how thorough the crime scene investigation was." He jokingly added, "It's not usual to use mosquitoes. In training, we were not told to keep an eye on mosquitoes at a crime scene." Despite the fact that we don't know all the details of how the case ultimately turned out, if you ask us, this is still one for the history books. When it comes to forensic science, we all know that DNA has long been the gold standard in terms of securing criminal convictions and solving crimes. In the overwhelming majority of these cases, we're used to seeing this DNA coming directly from perpetrators or victims. However, as this next case reminds us, sometimes investigators are forced to get a little more creative. In May of 1992, a motorcyclist stumbled across a horrifying scene in a deserted area of Maricopa County, Arizona, somewhere on the outskirts of the city of Phoenix. It was the partially clothed, lifeless body of a woman. She had been beaten and strangled to death, and her ankles had been loosely bound with shoelaces and what appeared to be some sort of wire. When police arrived at the scene, they noticed a t-shirt around the woman's neck. They theorized that this is what had been used to strangle her, and given the woman's state of undress, they also suspected that the crime might have been sexually motivated. When an autopsy was performed on the woman's body, a fingerprint search revealed a match. The victim was identified as 30-year-old Denise Johnson, a single mother of 2 children. Denise had had a tough life, and as a young woman, things had only gotten more difficult for her when she got into drugs. In turn, she made her living mostly by selling drugs at truck stops in the Phoenix area, and was somewhat notorious for shortchanging truck drivers during these deals. It was easy to see how Denise could have gotten herself into trouble if she ripped off the wrong person. Luckily for investigators, it didn't take long for them to find their first major lead in the case. While analyzing the crime scene, they heard sounds of an electronic device beeping. It turned out to be a pager that belonged to a 34-year-old local truck driver named Mark Bogan. He lived less than a 20-minute drive away from the place where Denise's body had been found. When questioned about his activities leading up to the murder, Bogan fully admitted that he had been with Denise the previous night. He said that she had approached him while he had stopped to use a payphone at a truck stop on the way home from work, and had asked him for a ride to the interstate. The two had hopped into Bogan's pickup truck after the call and had left shortly thereafter. Bogan stated that along the way, Denise had made advances towards him, and he had pulled over along the side of the road so that they could get intimate. He claimed that at some point, though, he had realized that this had merely been a ruse to steal from him, and the two had gotten into a fight over his wallet before he kicked Denise out of the vehicle. He said that he didn't initially know that his pager was missing, but that Denise must have taken it during that same struggle, and that was how it had been found near her body. Bogan claimed that he was innocent of the murder, and moreover, that he had never even been to the area where Denise's body was found. Police didn't buy Bogan's story, and in particular were suspicious of a small scratch mark to his face that they noticed while questioning him. They thought that this injury could have been from Denise scratching him during a struggle before her murder, and decided to test under her fingernails for blood or skin samples. Much to the surprise of investigators, though, no such evidence was found during Denise's autopsy. What's more, it seemed that there was no other physical evidence present at the crime scene or on her body that linked Bogan to the crime. It seemed like the case was in serious trouble, until police stumbled across a chance discovery. While analyzing the crime scene, one of the homicide detectives assigned to the case noticed a mark on a Palo Verde tree very close to where Denise's body was found. For those unfamiliar, Palo Verde trees are some of the most drought-tolerant trees in the world and thrive in the southwestern United States and Mexico. So much so that the Palo Verde is the state tree of Arizona. Because the mark to this specific Palo Verde tree appeared fresh, and the tree was in such close proximity to the crime scene, police theorized that it was probably related to their investigation. Detectives photographed the mark on the tree and plucked a couple of bean pods off of it to keep as evidence. Around the same time that this was happening, investigators conducted a search of Mark Bogan's pickup truck. Like during Denise's autopsy, no physical evidence of great significance had been found inside. However, detectives did make one noteworthy discovery in the bed of the truck. It was a couple of bean pods that also happened to have come from a Palo Verde tree. This caused investigators to theorize that the mark left on the Palo Verde tree at the crime scene had been made by Bogan's truck, and that the bean pods had fallen into the bed of his truck when he had hit it. The only question now was whether police could prove it. In order to do so, they would need to try and prove that the bean pods had come from the same tree. While plants, like all living things, have DNA, this kind of comparison had never been done in forensics before. Police reached out to countless experts with their task, until finally they found a plant geneticist at the University of Arizona who agreed to try and help them out. A man named Dr. Timothy Helenjaris. Dr. Helenjaris said that he would try to use a technique called randomly amplified polymorphic DNA, or RAPD, to compare the bean pods found in Bogan's truck to the tree found at the crime scene. According to sources we came across, RAPD is different than the restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP testing, that was normally used to analyze and compare human DNA samples at the time. Though not used in forensics up until that point, RAPD was common in lab research, and was especially useful for looking at genetic variation in organisms whose genomes had not been thoroughly mapped or sequenced, as was the case with the Palo Verde tree. While Dr. Helen Jarvis had now provided a way to potentially compare the two bean pod samples, investigators knew that because the technique was unprecedented in a criminal trial, it wouldn't be enough to simply show that the two bean pods were a match. They would also have to show that there was significant variation in the DNA between Palo Verde trees themselves. Basically, that they were unique enough that you couldn't simply match a bean pod to any random tree. In order to do this, investigators collected samples from 100 different Palo Verde trees and gave them to Dr. Helen Jarvis to test against the samples taken from Bogan's truck. Without telling them, they also slipped in one of the samples they had taken from the tree at the crime scene. When he conducted the tests, Dr. Helen Jarvis not only found that each one of the 100 Palo Verde trees had a distinct DNA profile, he also found that one of the samples was an exact match to the bean pods taken from Bogan's truck. Helen Jarvis apparently thought that he had made a mistake, until investigators informed him that they had actually snuck in the sample. The results made police confident that the case was now ready for trial. Mark Bogan had definitely been at the scene of the crime. He was arrested and charged with Denise's murder. At Bogan's trial, the prosecution relied heavily on the plant DNA evidence, as much of the rest of the case was circumstantial. The defense initially tried to get the plant DNA excluded as evidence from the proceedings altogether. However, when that failed, they switched to arguing that the evidence was planted. No pun intended, of course. This also failed, and in May of 1993, Mark Bogan was the first person in the United States, and possibly the world, to be convicted based on plant DNA evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison, and subsequent attempts to overturn the verdict were unsuccessful. In the years since Bogan's conviction, numerous other cases have also relied upon plant DNA evidence, though it still seems to be a relatively unknown technique as far as the popular consciousness is concerned. At around 11 p.m. on April 26, 2005, police in Durham, North Carolina received a frantic 911 call from a man named Raven Abaroa. He said that he had found his 25-year-old wife, Janet, unresponsive and covered in blood in an upstairs room of their Spring Valley home. He believed that she had been shot. When officers arrived at the residence, they encountered a scene that was equally mysterious and horrifying. Janet Abaroa was quickly pronounced dead, though from stab wounds, not gunshots, as Raven had previously described. Nothing else in the house appeared to be disturbed, and the couple's 6-month-old son, Caden, who was at home with his mother at the time she was killed, was left unharmed in another room. Who could be responsible for such a seemingly senseless, yet specifically targeted crime? It was a question that would haunt and intrigue local residents and police alike. One that would finally be answered years later, thanks to the seemingly smallest shred of evidence. When Raven Abaroa and Janet Christensen met at Southern Virginia University in 1998, it seemed like it was meant to be. The two clicked instantly, both coming from Mormon families and bonding over their mutual love of soccer. Just 2 years later, the two were married at the Mormon Temple in Washington, D.C. Family and friends thought of them as the perfect couple. A little while after getting married, Raven and Janet moved from Virginia to Durham, North Carolina for new career opportunities. They had both gotten jobs at a company called Eurosport, a large sports retailer that specialized in soccer. Given the couple's shared love of the game, it was the perfect fit. Despite the couple's outward success, over the next couple of years, problems began to arise in their marriage. Raven was unfaithful, and as time passed, even began to suggest that he wanted out of the relationship permanently. The cracks in the marriage were becoming obvious to some members of the couple's family, and it seemed like the marriage might be over until Janet got pregnant. Janet initially continued to express concerns about her relationship with Raven to her family, but as her due date drew closer, things seemed to calm down, and it appeared as if the two of them were working things out. In October of 2004, their son Caden was born, and Raven and Janet both said that they were committed to starting fresh. Raven, in particular, swore that he would stop cheating, and would do whatever he needed in order to make the marriage a happy one. However, almost as soon as Janet started to trust her husband again, she was dealt another serious blow when Raven was caught stealing from the company they both worked for near the end of 2004. The company pressed charges for embezzlement, and Janet, who was humiliated by the situation, decided that she would resign to avoid further embarrassment. 4 months later, Janet was dead. Making the crime even darker, following an autopsy, investigators learned that Janet had been several weeks pregnant at the time of her death. Naturally, Raven Abaroa was an immediate suspect in his wife's murder. Aside from the couple's ongoing marital problems, there were their recently exposed financial problems as well. It turned out that before he was fired, Raven had actually been stealing from their employer to pay the bills. Janet's death would seem to completely take care of Raven's financial difficulties, as if her life insurance policy paid out, he stood to gain $500,000. Finally, Janet had been stabbed to death, and Raven had a knife collection that mysteriously could not be located when police searched their home. Despite these suspicious details, Raven provided police with a seemingly airtight alibi. He said that on the night of Janet's murder, he had been playing soccer at an indoor field with some friends, at least a 20-minute drive away. He said that he had left the house at some time after 8 p.m. that night and hadn't returned until the time that he made the 911 call at close to 11 p.m. He said that when he left the house, Janet was getting ready for bed and was watching TV in their room. With no concrete evidence tying Raven to the crime, police decided not to file charges against him. Still, they didn't go so far as to rule him out, and he remained a suspect in Janet's murder. Meanwhile, other leads failed to materialize, and the case began to go cold. Following the initial investigation, Raven pleaded guilty to embezzlement for stealing from his former employer, but avoided serving any jail time. Instead, he took his son and moved to Utah to start a new life. Meanwhile, at the 1-year mark of Janet's murder, local media reported that there were no suspects in the case. Janet's family was left still desperately searching for answers. Once in Utah, Raven met and began dating another woman named Vanessa Pond, whose daughter was in the same daycare program as Raven's son. When Vanessa learned about Janet's murder, she was alarmed, but Raven managed to smooth-talk his way out of any suspicion, convincing her that he was innocent and saying that the police were trying to frame him. A little over 3 years after Janet's murder, with the case still unsolved, Raven and Vanessa were married in a small ceremony in the backyard of Vanessa's parents' home. It wasn't long, though, before Vanessa began to see a different side of her new husband. His moods could turn on a dime. He would say horrible things to her, and he became increasingly physically abusive. Up until now, Vanessa had believed that Raven was not involved in the murder of his first wife, but when she started to fear for her own safety, her feelings quickly changed. After only a few months of marriage, Vanessa separated from Raven, and the marriage was annulled. In the spring of 2009, Vanessa decided to go one step further and went public with her fears that Raven had murdered Janet. By this time, Janet's family was also completely convinced of Raven's guilt, and they too began to put pressure on police. A new detective named Charles Soule was assigned to the case, and he threw himself into the investigation head first. While meticulously reviewing the case files, Soule stumbled upon a detail that would blow the investigation wide open. He was looking at crime scene photos when he came across one picture that stood out to him. On a counter pictured in the photo, the detective noticed Janet's contact lens case, which appeared to have the top removed. This said to him that the contact lenses probably weren't inside. Why was this an important detail? Well, Soule had been told by Janet's friends and family that she always removed her contact lenses before going to bed. If true, this seemed to contradict the initial story that Raven had told police at the time of Janet's murder. He said that when he had left the house to go to his soccer game that night, his wife had been getting ready for bed and was watching TV, meaning that she should have already taken out her contacts. This inconsistency was so jarring to Soule that he felt that it was strong enough, in addition with the suspicious details police already had, to move the case to the next level. And in February of 2010, Raven was arrested and charged with Janet's murder. Soule believed that the contact lens discrepancy not only proved that Raven had lied to investigators, but also invalidated his alibi. Because if Janet had been killed before she got ready for bed, it showed that Raven could have committed the murder before he left the house for his soccer game. In order to prove his theory, though, Soule knew that he would have to take a gamble. He spoke to experts and asked if they might still be able to find Janet's contact lenses with her body if they had her remains exhumed. The people that Soule talked to said it was possible, and in July of 2010, Janet's body was exhumed. Amazingly, when forensics experts examined the remains, they were able to find small fragments that they believed were what was left of Janet's contact lenses. When the fragments were brought to an ophthalmologist, he cleaned the fragments with sterile water. They not only swelled from the hydration, but took on the noticeably convex shape typical of contact lenses. The final confirmation came when the ophthalmologist was able to find manufacturing numbers on one of the fragments, conclusively proving that they were AccuView contact lenses. Subsequent tests were performed to assess the decay rates of contact lenses by replicating the conditions under which they were buried, and these were also found to be consistent with what investigators found with Janet's remains. With that, prosecutors decided to take the case to court. Sadly, despite the ingenious way with which Janet's murder had been solved, proving the case at trial was far more difficult. When the case first went to court in 2013, the trial ended with a deadlocked jury who voted 11-1 to convict. The single holdout caused the judge in the case to declare a mistrial. Ahead of Raven's second trial in the spring of 2014, he made a deal with prosecutors and entered an Alford plea, acknowledging that there was enough evidence to convict him, but not admitting guilt. The plea was for the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter, and Raven was sentenced to 95 to 123 months in jail, though was given 4 years credit for time served while awaiting trial. On Christmas Day of 2017, Raven was released as a free man. While the case understandably continues to draw controversy, with many believing Raven's seemingly light sentencing was an injustice, it's worth pointing out that a conviction might not have been made at all were it not for the keen eye of a single investigator who found the vital clue to crack the case. If you think about it, it's even mildly poetic. In life, Janet's contact lenses had allowed her to see the world around her. In death, they had helped the world to see the truth about her murder. As always, don't forget to let us know if there are other stories like this that you've heard of that you think we missed, or additional story ideas that you want to send our way. With that said, take care, and thank you for watching.